Have you ever had the feeling that something is watching you? But not with eyes, but with logic? I did. And it all started with an envelope with no return address, an impossible equation, and a phrase that haunted me for weeks. Solve this and you'll find my killer. It wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. And I accepted. The name Elias Vilar wasn't unfamiliar to me. A brilliant, reclusive mathematician who died locked inside his office. The police called it suicide. I called it a challenge. Because Elias didn't leave a farewell letter. He left a code. A code that, when deciphered, reveals not only a crime, it reveals who you are. This investigation has led me down paths that logic cannot explain. Encounters with the past, dilemmas that defy reason, and an equation that seems to know more about me than I do myself. What if the real mystery isn't about who killed Elias, but about whom he chose to continue? Before we begin, tell me something. Where are you watching this video from? I want to know if I've investigated any cases out there, or if perhaps the next one is closer than you think. I've never been one to believe in coincidences. When I received that envelope with no return address, containing a handwritten equation and a single sentence, "Solve this and you'll find my killer," I felt a chill that didn't come from the cold. It was as if someone had invaded my mind even before knocking on my door. The equation seemed alive, pulsating, almost mocking. And I, of course, couldn't resist. The name Elias Vilar came to mind like a punch to the gut. A brilliant, reclusive mathematician who died locked inside his own office. The police called it suicide. I called it a challenge. Elias was not a man to give up, much less to remain silent. And that equation, it wasn't a goodbye. It was an invitation. The blackboard was still there, the chalk marks intact. The teacup was lukewarm. The window was ajar, as if someone had left without a trace. Everything screamed for attention, but what held my attention was Elias's frozen gaze in the last photo taken of him. A look that seemed to know I was coming. That I would understand. Since then, something has changed. Not just in the case, but in me. The equation began to visit me in dreams, as if trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear yet. And that's when I realized, this investigation wouldn't be about an ordinary crime. It would be about logic, yes, but also about identity, time, and perhaps about myself. Elias Vilar was not just a mathematician. He was a kind of living legend among academic circles, the type of mind that solved problems we didn't even know existed. Reclusive, eccentric, and with a history of disagreements with colleagues, he lived surrounded by books and theories that few dared to question. They said he talked to himself, sometimes with equations, and that he believed he was being watched by something that wasn't human. The last time Elias was seen alive was at a conference on symbolic logic, where he presented a theorem that no one could refute or understand. 3 days later, he was found dead in his office, locked from the inside, with no signs of struggle. The police concluded that he took his own life. But something didn't add up. Elias wasn't a man to give up, much less to leave enigmas unsolved. The building where he lived was old, silent, almost forgotten by time. The neighbors barely knew his name. One of them told me that, the night before his death, he heard strange sounds, as if someone were reciting numbers aloud, followed by an abrupt silence. Elias lived alone, but he seemed to be talking to someone, or to something, and that unsettled me. I went through old files, interviews, published articles. I discovered that Elias had been working on a theory about the equation of identity, something that mixed mathematical logic with existential philosophy. He believed that mathematics could reveal who we are, or who we think we are. What if this equation was more than just a problem? What if it was a key? Elias's office seemed frozen in time. The blackboard displayed the equation as if it had been written seconds before my arrival, the chalk still fresh. The teacup resting on the table exuded a soft aroma of chamomile, too warm for a lifeless body. The half-open window let in a strange breeze, as if the air itself were restless. Nothing there made sense, and everything seemed deliberate. There were no signs of forced entry, nor of a struggle. The door was locked from the inside, and the key lay on the desk, as if Elias wanted to ensure that no one would interrupt him. But why leave the window open? Why write such a complex equation before dying? Every detail seemed like a piece of a puzzle that didn't want to be put together. And I was already inside it. I rummaged through drawers, examined books, touched objects as if searching for a forgotten whisper. I found a bookmark in a logic book, with a handwritten note, "Truth lies in paradox." That made me stop. Elias wasn't just solving a problem. He was leaving a trail. And I, without realizing it, was already following it. The feeling was of being watched. Not by someone, but by something. The silence of the place was dense, almost physical. And the equation on the board seemed to stare at me, as if it knew I wouldn't be able to ignore it. Elias didn't die there by chance. That room was a theater, and I had just stepped onto the stage. The show, it seemed, was only just beginning. Getting to know Elias Vilar was like trying to decipher a code without a key. He lived in his own world, where numbers spoke louder than words. He had an obsessive, almost ritualistic routine. He would wake up at 4 a.m., solve problems until noon, and then immerse himself in books that mixed mathematics with metaphysics. He didn't keep friends. He didn't trust anyone. And, according to accounts, he spoke with presences that only he could see. His medical history indicated episodes of mild paranoia, but nothing that justified total isolation. Elias believed that someone, or something, was watching him. Not through the windows, but through his thoughts. He said that certain thoughts attracted entities. That some equations shouldn't be solved. And that the human mind, when it crosses certain limits, becomes vulnerable. This made me wonder, did he cross that line? I spoke with a former university colleague who described Elias as too brilliant for this world. He couldn't accept mistakes or doubts. He was a perfectionist to the extreme, and any failure would leave him in a state of silent fury. But what struck me most was a phrase Elias frequently repeated: logic is the only way to escape illusion. As if he were trapped in something only he could see. This psychological profile not only complicated the investigation, it made it personal. Because the deeper I delved into Elias's mind, the more I felt he wanted to be found. Not as a victim, but as an enigma. What if he wasn't trying to escape something external? What if the real enemy was inside him? Or inside the equation? The equation Elias left behind wasn't just complex, it was undecipherable. It mixed advanced algebra with symbols I'd never seen before, some seemingly taken from ancient manuscripts. There was a numerical sequence that repeated itself in strange patterns, as if trying to form a hidden message. It wasn't an ordinary formula. It was a code. And I knew that if I deciphered it, something big would come to light. I spent nights trying to understand the elements of the equation. I used software, consulted experts, even turned to a retired cryptographer. They all said the same thing: it didn't make sense. But I disagreed. Elias wouldn't leave something without purpose. Every symbol, every number, every blank space, everything seemed to have an intention. And the intention, I felt, was to lead me somewhere. I began to realize that the equation reacted to how I interpreted it. When I tried to solve it as a mathematical problem, it closed itself off. But when I treated it as an enigma, it opened up to possibilities. It was as if Elias had created a logical labyrinth, where the exit was not an answer, but a revelation. And I was getting closer and closer to something I couldn't name. Gradually, the equation began to affect me. I saw the symbols in dreams, heard numbers in quiet places. It was as if Elias had left a piece of his mind there, waiting for someone who could continue. What if this equation wasn't just a code? What if it was a door? While browsing through the books on Elias's shelf, one caught my eye. It was an old volume on symbolic logic, with yellowed pages and the smell of intellectual dust. In the middle of the book, an improvised bookmark made from a torn piece of paper. On it, a handwritten phrase: "Truth lies in paradox." That wasn't just any quote. It was a provocation. The phrase seemed to pulsate, as if it had been left there for me. Elias knew I would find it, and he knew I would understand. Paradox, the contradiction that reveals, the logic that defies logic. I began to reread the book with different eyes, searching for patterns, deviations, hidden messages among the symbols. And the more I read, the more I felt that Elias was guiding me. There were notes in the margins, scribbles that seemed random, but formed a sequence. Letters, numbers, arrows, a mind map. Elias wasn't just studying, he was coding, transforming ideas into clues. And that phrase, that marker, was the first step. The equation wasn't the beginning. It was the middle. The real beginning was there, between the pages. It was at that moment that I realized, Elias didn't want me to solve the equation. He wanted me to live it. To enter it like one enters a labyrinth. What if this clue was only the first layer? What if the paradox was more than just an idea? Perhaps it was a key. Or a trap. 3 names emerged strongly in the early days of the investigation. All had motives. All had unresolved issues with Elias. The first was Clara Mendez, a brilliant former student whom Elias publicly humiliated after she challenged one of his theories. Since then, she has distanced herself from academia and immersed herself in alternative studies. It is said that she swore never to speak his name again. But the resentment, that never faded. The second was Elias's brother, Samuel Vilar, a religious, austere man who saw his brother's obsession as an affront to faith. The two hadn't spoken for years. Samuel believed Elias was playing God, trying to decipher the secrets of the universe with numbers. When he learned of the death, he didn't cry. He only said, "He went too far." Words that stuck in my mind like a dark echo. The third was Professor Alvaro Telles, an academic rival who lost an international scholarship because of Elias. The two vied for recognition, but Elias always came out on top. Alvaro was charismatic, but there was something in his gaze, a contained anger disguised as cordiality. When I interviewed him, he told me, Elias was brilliant, yes, but also dangerous. And I couldn't ignore the weight of that sentence. 3 people, 3 stories, 3 possible truths. But something bothered me. None of them seemed surprised by the death. It was as if they had expected it. As if Elias had left clues for everyone. What if, instead of a guilty party, I was facing unwitting accomplices? Or worse, pieces in a game that Elias started long before he died. I don't usually get emotionally involved with cases. But this one started to affect me in a strange way. Elias's equation wouldn't leave my head. I dreamed about it, woke up with it, saw its symbols and reflections, in shadows, even in the cracks in the wall. It was as if I was being pulled into something I couldn't control. And that started to scare me. I began to wonder if I was being manipulated. Not by someone, but by the very logic of the equation. As if Elias had left a trail that didn't lead to the killer, but to myself. With each attempt to decipher it, I felt I was losing a little of my lucidity. What if this case wasn't about justice? What if it was about transformation? Or worse, about substitution? I talked to colleagues, tried to vent, but no one understood. They said I was obsessed, that I needed a break. But how could I rest when the equation seemed to breathe? When the mystery wasn't just external, but internal? I started to doubt myself. And that, for an investigator, is the beginning of the end. Or perhaps, the beginning of something bigger. That's when I realized, Elias didn't just want to be understood. He wanted to be continued. What if the equation was a mirror? A reflection of what I could become? Maybe I wasn't investigating a crime. Maybe I was being prepared for something. Something that didn't yet have a name, but that was already calling to me. While analyzing the numerical sequence of the equation, something seemed familiar. It was as if I had seen that pattern before, but I couldn't remember where. I searched through my old files, archived cases, forgotten notes. And then, there it was, a disappearance in 1987 of a professor named Otavio Lins, who also worked with advanced logic. The detail? He left a similar code before disappearing. Otavio was never found. His last known record was a letter sent to the mathematics department, containing an equation that no one could solve. The police treated it as a voluntary escape. But I always found it strange. Now, with Elias dead and a similar equation in hand, the coincidence became impossible to ignore. It was as if the two cases were connected by something bigger. I returned to the place where Otavio was last seen, a university library that is now abandoned. There, among the rubble, I found a note on a peeling wall. The mind that solves is the mind that disappears. The same phrase was in one of Elias's notebooks. This was no coincidence. It was continuity. And I was in the middle of it. I began to wonder if Elias knew Otavio. If the two were involved in something that went beyond academia. A kind of secret society. A thought experiment. Or just two men who went too far in their search for answers. Whatever it was, the equation seemed to be the link. And perhaps, an invitation to follow the same path. It was when I started playing with the equation in front of the mirror that everything changed. Reflected, it seemed to take on another form. The symbols rearranged themselves, revealing something that wasn't visible before. In the reflection, a sequence of numbers stood out, like coordinates. I grabbed a map, checked the digits, and could hardly believe it. They pointed to a remote location in the interior of Goya's. Elias wasn't just playing with logic. He was guiding. The idea that the equation had a hidden version in the mirror unsettled me. It was as if Elias knew someone would try to decipher it conventionally, and therefore hid the truth on the other side. I started calling this the mirror theory. Inverted logic that reveals what is hidden. What if everything I knew up to now was upside down? What if the true path was the reflection? I packed my backpack, got in the car, and headed towards the coordinates. The road was deserted, surrounded by silence and dust. With each kilometer, I felt myself moving away from the real world and closer to something Elias wanted me to see. It wasn't just an investigation. It was a journey. And I didn't know what awaited me on the other side. I arrived at the indicated location, an abandoned cabin hidden among twisted trees. The door was ajar, as if waiting for me. I entered cautiously, feeling the ground creak beneath my feet. And there, amidst the mold and silence, I found something that would change everything. A diary. What if what was written there was more than just memories? Perhaps it was a confession. The cabin seemed forgotten by time. Rotten wood, broken windows, and a silence that wasn't just an absence of sound. It was the presence of something that didn't want to be named. I entered slowly, flashlight in hand, smelling the musty and damp earth. The place bore signs of recent occupation, despite its abandonment. Footprints on the floor, a melted candle, and a notebook on the table, as if someone had left in a hurry. The notebook was covered in dust, but the inside pages were intact. It was Elias's diary. The handwriting was firm, meticulous, as if each letter were part of an equation. The first pages spoke of theories, numbers, paradoxes. But as I progressed, the tone changed. Elias began to write as if conversing with someone, or something that wasn't physically there. He spoke of a presence that guided him, that made him see hidden patterns in reality. He said the equation was a portal, a way to access the structure behind the structure. And that, by solving it, he would finally understand what lies beyond logic. It was disturbing, not because it seemed crazy, but because it made sense. And that put me on alert. At the end of the diary, a sentence highlighted in red. If you've made it this far, it's because you've already begun to disappear. I closed the notebook with trembling hands. Elias wasn't just leaving clues. He was leaving a legacy, and perhaps a curse. But what intrigued me most was, why did he choose this place? And what else might be hidden there? As I leafed through the last pages of the diary, something paralyzed me. Elias wasn't writing like someone afraid of dying. He was writing like someone who knew he would die. He spoke of a breaking point, a moment when the equation would reveal the truth about reality. And that, upon crossing that threshold, he would cease to be just a man. It was as if he had accepted the end as part of the experiment. The language shifted from rational to almost mystical. Elias said the equation wasn't a solution, but a revelation. That by solving it, he would become visible to those who observe. And that this would make him a target. Not by people, but by forces that cannot tolerate awakening. It was hard to believe, but impossible to ignore. Because everything he wrote seemed to be happening to me. He described symptoms that I was also beginning to feel. Insomnia, visions, the sensation of being followed by something unseen. Elias didn't kill himself. He offered himself. As if the equation were a ritual, an invocation. And I, by following in his footsteps, was repeating the same path. The difference. I could still choose to stop. But did I want to? I closed the diary with a lump in my throat. Elias wasn't just a victim. He was the architect of his own death. And if he foresaw all of this, then perhaps he foresaw my arrival as well. Perhaps I wasn't investigating a crime. Perhaps I was being initiated. And what would come next was yet to be deciphered. Deep inside the diary, between pages worn apart by time, I found a smaller envelope, sealed with red wax. Inside, there was a folded sheet of paper with a new equation, as enigmatic as the first, but with a different structure. It was as if it complemented the previous one, as if they were two halves of the same code. Elias didn't just leave a riddle. He left a system. And I was about to enter it. The second equation seemed more philosophical than mathematical. It mixed formal logic with symbols that alluded to identity, duality, and time. It was as if Elias were trying to prove something about existence itself. I began to compare the two formulas side by side and realized that together they formed a pattern. A cycle. As if the answer lay in repetition. Or in breaking it. I spent hours trying to decipher what it meant. Each attempt led me to a new question, never to an answer. It was as if Elias was forcing me to think outside of traditional logic. The equation didn't want to be solved. It wanted to be lived, interpreted, felt. And that made me more and more involved. As if I were being molded by it. The feeling was clear. Elias didn't want anyone to solve the equation. He wanted someone to understand it. What if that second part was the key to understanding what he was really looking for? Maybe it wasn't about numbers. Maybe it was about identity. What if, in the end, the equation was trying to tell me who I am? On the back of the second equation, Elias had written something that seemed more like a provocation than a clue. If you know who you are, then you are not. If you don't know, then you are. I read and reread that sentence dozens of times, trying to find meaning in it. It was a paradox, of course, but also a mental trap, a dilemma that called into question the very notion of identity. And I began to wonder, who am I in this investigation? The phrase haunted me for days. It seemed simple, but the more I thought about it, the more it unfolded. If knowing who you are means not being, then is knowledge an illusion? And what if not knowing is the true essence? Elias was playing with the limits of logic and consciousness. And I, without realizing it, was already inside the game. A game that had no clear rules, only consequences. I started applying the dilemma to the suspects, the clues, and myself. And I realized that perhaps Elias was trying to show that the truth lies not in who did the act, but in who understands it. That the guilty party is not the one who acts, but the one who deciphers the truth. It was a complete inversion of investigative logic. And that left me vulnerable. Because, for the first time, I didn't know if I was investigating or being investigated. This enigma wasn't just a phrase. It was a mirror, a test, and perhaps a password. Elias didn't want me to find someone to blame. He wanted me to find myself. But for that, I would have to accept that the answer might not be outside, but inside. And what if this dilemma was the key to deciphering everything that would follow? When I took my findings to the police station, I expected at least curiosity. But what I received was skepticism. The detective looked at me as if I had lost my mind. Equations, mirrors, presences, he repeated, as if I were telling a work of fiction. For them, Elias was just another closed case. Suicide due to eccentricity. Nothing more than that. I tried to show the connections, the patterns, the symbols. I talked about Otavio Lin's case, the coordinates, the diary. But the more I explained, the more they closed ranks. One of the investigators even asked me if I was okay. And, to be honest, I didn't even know anymore. Because, deep down, I was starting to doubt too. Not the logic, but the reality it revealed. Tensions rose when I requested access to confidential documents. I was denied. They said I was interfering in a closed case. But how do you close something that still pulsates? That still speaks? I started working alone, away from the official eyes. And that put me in a delicate position. Because, if I was right, I would be a hero. But if I was wrong, I would just be another madman. Even so, I continued. Because Elias didn't trust the police. He trusted me. And if they didn't want to listen, I would. But what worried me was something else. What if what I was discovering couldn't be proven? What if the truth didn't fit into reports? Maybe the next step wasn't to convince anyone. Maybe it was to go deeper. It was Clara Mendez who finally broke the silence. The former student, now a teacher, contacted me after attending a lecture where I mentioned Elias. She seemed nervous, but determined. She said she knew the equation. That Elias had shared parts of it with her years ago, as a test. And that, yes, she knew what it meant, but not in the way I imagined. Clara revealed that Elias believed the equation was a way to transcend human logic. That by solving it, he would cease to be just a man. She didn't kill him, she said. He killed himself by choice. But he used the equation as a way to leave a legacy, and perhaps to take revenge. Because he knew that by leaving that to me, I too would be pulled into the same abyss. She confessed that she helped Elias construct the equation's structure. That the archaic symbols came from ancient manuscripts, and that the patterns were inspired by codes used by secret societies. But she denied any direct involvement in the death. He wanted it this way, she said. He wanted someone to follow him. And you were the chosen one. Words that left me speechless. The police didn't accept that version of events. Clara was questioned, but nothing was proven. And I was left with the feeling that Elias didn't have a killer. He had an accomplice. Someone who understood his mind but couldn't prevent his downfall. And if Clara was telling the truth, then perhaps the real mystery wasn't who killed Elias. But why did he choose me? It was in a silent early morning that everything fell into place. I was standing before the chart, with the two equations side by side, when I noticed a hidden pattern, not in the numbers, but in the words Elias had left. The equation didn't reveal the murderer. It revealed the profile of the person who would solve it. And, in deciphering it, I realized it described me. Every line, every symbol, every logic was about me. The penny dropped like a bolt of lightning. Elias didn't want justice. He wanted continuity. He constructed the equation as a filter, a test, an intellectual trap. And I, by passing through it, became his successor. Not by choice, but by affinity. It was as if he had studied me even before he died. As if he knew I would be the only one capable, or the only one vulnerable enough, to understand. I stood there, staring at the painting as one stares at a mirror. The equation wasn't an answer. It was a revelation. And the revelation was simple and brutal. I had been chosen. Not to solve a crime, but to continue a journey. Elias didn't die by chance. He withdrew. And he left me the invitation. An invitation that, now, I didn't know if I could refuse. I turned off the lights, sat in the armchair, and faced the silence. The equation was still there, like a living shadow. And I knew that, from then on, nothing would be the same. Because when you solve something that shouldn't be solved, you don't go back. And if Elias was right, then the next step wasn't to understand. It was to disappear. After everything, I was left with a question that won't leave me. Did Elias want to be found, or understood? Because there's a subtle difference between revealing a mystery and becoming part of it. The equation didn't give me answers. It gave me mirrors. And every time I looked at it, I saw less Elias and more of myself. Perhaps that was the real plan, to transform the investigator into the investigated. I spent days trying to distance myself from the case, but it followed me. In my thoughts, in my dreams, in my conversations. It was as if Elias had left a seed, and it was now germinating inside me. It wasn't obsession. It was continuity. And that made me think, are all the mysteries we investigate, at their core, about ourselves? The equation, the diary, the symbols. Everything seemed to point to a truth that cannot be contained in reports. Elias didn't want justice. He wanted transcendence. And perhaps he achieved it. But what troubles me is the fact that he chose me. Not by chance, but because of my profile. As if he knew that I too was searching for something beyond logic. Something I still don't know how to name. And now, with everything I've seen, everything I've felt, everything I've discovered, I wonder if Elias really died. Or if he merely changed form. Because there are mysteries that cannot be solved. They are absorbed. And if this was one of them, then perhaps the next step isn't to investigate. Perhaps it's to accept. But accept what? That remains an enigma. I returned to my office with my head full of silent noises. The equation, now complete, was drawn on the board in front of me. The lines were mine, but the origin was Elias's. I sat in the armchair, as he used to do, and stared at the symbols as one stares at a mirror. The room was dark, illuminated only by the dim light of the street. And in that silence, something seemed to move. I began to murmur the numbers, like Elias did. Not out of madness, but out of necessity. It was as if the equation only revealed itself when spoken in a low voice, like a secret. With each repetition, I felt time bend, as if the present were merging with something that had already happened. Logic became fluid. And I became part of it. The camera, if there had been one, would have captured a lone man, standing before a painting, speaking in symbols. But inside, I wasn't alone. Elias was there. Ottavio too. And perhaps others who came before. The equation was a line of succession. And I had crossed the point of no return. The question now wasn't, who killed Elias? It was, who will be next? That's when I heard the sound of paper sliding under the door. A new letter. No return address. With a symbol that appeared in Elias's equation. I opened it with trembling hands. And there, written in firm letters, was what I already expected. You are ready. The case was closed. But the investigation was only beginning. The next morning, while I was having my coffee, I heard the familiar sound of paper sliding under the door. It was another letter. No return address, no stamp, no signature. Just a symbol, the same one that appeared discreetly in Elias's equation. A circle crossed by a vertical line. And below it, a phrase, You've cracked it. Now you have to choose. The paper seemed to vibrate in my hands. The phrase wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. But what to choose? A new path? A new affair? Or a new identity? Elias had led me this far, but who was calling me now? The equation was complete, but the game seemed to have only changed levels. And I was already in it. I began to investigate the symbol. I discovered that it appears in ancient manuscripts, linked to societies that studied logic as a form of transcendence. One of them, lost decades ago, had as its motto, "The mind that sees never sleeps again." What if this letter was the beginning of a new investigation? One that Elias didn't start, but that I would have to finish? I kept the letter in the same place where I left the diary, because now everything was connected. Elias, Otavio, Clara, the symbol, the equation. And perhaps the next case wouldn't just involve logic. Perhaps it would involve faith, or madness, or both. But one thing was certain, someone out there is still playing. And I just received the next piece. After everything I experienced in this investigation, one thing became clear. Not every mystery needs to be solved, some need to be understood. Elias didn't leave me with an equation. He left me with a mirror. And looking into that mirror, I realized that logic can be a bridge, but it can also be an abyss. The question that remains is, how far are you willing to go to understand who you really are? Perhaps the greatest enigma of life lies not in the crimes, the clues, or the culprits. Perhaps it lies in the choices we make when no one is watching. Elias chose to disappear. I chose to continue. And you? What would you choose if you were given an equation that described your essence? Because sometimes what seems like a problem is just an invitation. If this story made you think, then it was already worth it. Because investigating isn't just about discovering what happened. It's about discovering what might still happen. And if you felt this journey touched you in some way, perhaps it's time to look at your own equation. The one you carry without realizing it. And who knows, maybe start deciphering it. If you enjoyed this investigation, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There's a lot more coming soon. And who knows, the next case might be closer than you think.